Hey, one thing I haven't spoken about for a while is the situation in Northern Ireland. The last video I made about Northern Ireland was about my own sense of identity, and if I'm being totally honest, got a bit irritated by some of the comments on that one, some of the feedback, which I found a bit presumptive and a bit just stubborn, not really listening to what I was saying. But that's the luck of the draw. That's the internet for you. People will pontificate. I've done it myself. We all do it. I know what my own feeling is, and ultimately that's all that matters in terms of how I approach things. So this isn't so much about my own identity. That's I may talk more about that as time goes on, but I want to talk about the situation post general election because for the first time the nationalist parties in Northern Ireland have outweighed the unionist parties. I believe I forget the exact figures, but Sinn Féin and the SDLP outweighed the DUP. Again, I don't know the exact figures here, so I'd need to look that up. But that's significant. It's the first time it's ever happened. Without question, Northern Ireland's a very different place than when I was born in 1985, and demographically speaking, at that time there was a clear Protestant Unionist majority. But of course, when we talk about Northern Ireland, it's important not to see it as black and white, like Catholic equals nationalist, Protestant equals unionist. That isn't always the case. There are nationalist Protestants and there are a few unionist Catholics. So they're not exactly tied to one another. Unionism equals Protestantism, Catholicism equals nationalism. I think that's a bit misleading to sort of assume that they're just tied. Nor do I intend to give a history lesson in this video. The return of the Northern Ireland Parliament in Stormont is in itself a good thing. It's never good for any territory to have no functioning system of government, as Northern Ireland has had for the last. I think it's been a few years now. I have to be honest. I these days I follow mainland politics a lot closer than Ulster politics. So frankly, I don't pay much attention to what's going on with the DUP or Sinn Féin or the SDLP or Alliance. Um, I'm more interested in the national picture with Labour and the Conservatives and the Lib Dems and so on. But in the coming months, I probably should get more interested because, of course, if this leads the way for a referendum on the status of Northern Ireland, then it's going to affect me. I can't see it happening in the immediate future because just a switch in the balance of power doesn't necessarily mean, oh, well, it's going to be a united Ireland in a couple of years. I don't think that's going to happen. Of course, the situation in Scotland, Sturgeon is now calling for another Scottish independence referendum on the grounds that the SNP have performed very well. But as she acknowledged herself, it would be a bit foolhardy to suggest that just because people voted SNP, ostensibly because of Brexit, among other reasons, doesn't mean they necessarily want independence. So when it comes to voting, the voting intentions is not always black and white. People vote for a variety of reasons. Um, and that's true of all four nations, actually. So when it comes to Northern Ireland, depending on how things develop, I'll no doubt have more things to say. I don't know what the future of this channel is going to be, but I will no doubt have views on that and want to express them. So as things develop, that will be something that I'll definitely have to consider. I will say this though, over 30 years of the Troubles, the IRA and other nationalist paramilitary groups thought that they could force a united Ireland by violence, by bombs and bullets, by maiming, injuring, and killing thousands of people. Thousands when you consider the many injured as well. I was just looking at a bit of a documentary about the mainland campaign in the 70s. I didn't watch all of it, but I kind of wanted to see what the comments were, and Some of them were talking about aspects of the investigations because there were a few notorious miscarriages of justice. The Birmingham Six, for example. My former MP, Chris Mullen, was actually involved in helping get them a reprieve. But the victims of Birmingham have never got justice. So when we talk about the situation around Bloody Sunday, former paratroopers being prosecuted, now men in their 70s, let's not forget that a lot of victims of the terrorist atrocities have never got justice either. Um, so those are open wounds that really, the survivors and the relatives still suffer 45 years on. So we could say that the troubles are long past, and in a sense they are, but not for the people who lost loved ones on both sides. I mean, let's not forget one of the worst atrocities during the Troubles was the Dublin and Monaghan bombings by loyalist paramilitaries. Now, that did come on top of a wave of IRA atrocities, but, two wrongs don't make a right, and the mass murder of civilians is always wrong. That was a deliberate attack targeting Irish civilians. It was wrong. Just as wrong as any of the IRA atrocities. I sometimes do feel that the attacks on the mainland sometimes overshadow what actually happened in Northern Ireland. I mean, for 30 years, there were atrocities on a similar scale to what happened in Birmingham and Guildford and Aldershot and Warrington happening every month, every week almost in Northern Ireland. And it almost became the norm. Well, it did really in the mid 70s. I mean, in the year 1974, I believe something like 10,000 bombings were recorded. Now, many of them would have been small scale, but many of them did cause death and injury. So that gives you an idea of the sort of extent of the conflict at that time. The good news is I don't think Northern Ireland will ever return to that scale of violence. Nevertheless, as we saw from the murder of Lyra McKee earlier this year, there is a small but determined group of terrorist thugs who want this to continue in that direction. My gut feeling is there may be a united Ireland in my lifetime on the grounds that the demographics in Northern Ireland have radically changed. From, like I said, when I was born in the mid 80s, it was strongly weighing in the unionist side of things. Now it's roughly 50-50, if anything, slightly more nationalist. So I think it is very plausible that in my lifetime, maybe not in the next 5 years, maybe not even in the next 10 years, but possibly within the next 20 years, there may be a united Ireland. And the 100 years of Northern Ireland being in the United Kingdom will be history. My sentiments about that. I mean, I'll of course it's something I'll comment about if that situation becomes plausible. What people on I've said this before, and this I know this works people up. It's something that has to be said. Ulster Unionism is something that neither Irish nationalists nor people on the mainland really understand. Because there's this stereotype with Ulster Unionism. It's kind of like people think religious fanatics, they think Ian Paisley, they think bigotry towards Catholics. And there is unquestionably an aspect of that there. I mean, I wouldn't associate myself with, for example, the Orange Lodge or the Apprentice Boys or any of that sort of, solid Ulster Unionism. That's not my own upbringing. It's not my own thinking. I'm quite well travelled, and I do think there is a bigotry in Ulster Unionism I deeply dislike, not just towards Catholics, but towards minorities. Unfortunately, Northern Ireland is one of the most racist parts of the United Kingdom. Attacks on migrants and attacks on, well, basically anyone who isn't white is a serious problem there. It's something that needs to be tackled urgently. Um, I mean, it's no surprise that some of the unionist paramilitaries have close links to far right groups in England, and that's long been the way. So, being a Northern Irish person from the unionist side of things, I utterly denounce that. I have friends from the Irish Republic, um, and I have Catholic friends. So I've never seen myself as sectarian in that sense. But also unionism, it does make me angry when you get people, especially from other parts of the world, and very often they're from countries that have animosity with this one, China, Russia, and Islamic countries. They have a vested interest in being anti-British, so they come out with things like Ireland for the Irish. Now, if this was coming from Irish nationalists, I would not necessarily agree. I would say it's more complex than that. I would understand, okay, they're Irish nationalists, they would say that. But, when it comes from Chinese, for example, they're the last people on earth to talk about subjugating people when you consider what they've done in Tibet and Xinjiang and elsewhere. Anyway, I detract. Um, One comment got me really worked up on this documentary. It was, I'm on the side of the Irish. But it's this kind of catch-all. The Scottish Nationalists do this as well, like we're representatives of Scotland. One point I would make about the Troubles, and this is extremely important, the Irish government had strong disagreements with the British government over the status of Northern Ireland, and that's always been the way. They believe ultimately in the United Ireland, but they always denounced IRA terrorism. The Irish government never endorsed IRA or INLA terrorism. When those atrocities were happening on the mainland, Dublin always responded with outrage. In fact, there was protests in the Republic, I believe, after the Warrington attack, in protest against the IRA. So one thing that we need to be very careful of is pitching this about the Irish versus the British, because that leads to all sorts of problems. Unfortunately, in the 70s, there was anti-Irish discrimination in this country. There was those notorious signs in pubs in England, no Irish and no blacks. So there was unquestionably anti-Irish bigotry going on, and it was based on a sort of collective vilification of the Irish because of the actions of the IRA, which is why we have to be careful not to vilify all Muslims because of the actions of Islamists today, and reject those neo-nationalist types who do. So when people pitch it as Ireland versus Britain, it's just a grotesque distortion because the Irish government always condemned that. Yes, they had deep disagreements with the British government over the status of Northern Ireland, and they still do. But the fact of the matter is, the Republic of Ireland is our close trading partner, and I really hope that post Brexit we can have very close and good relations with the Republic of Ireland. It makes total sense. They're one of our closest trade partners. They're another, they're a fellow Western democracy. It makes total sense that we have close trade, not just in trade. I would say friendship as well, and not to be overly sentimental about it, but yeah, um, British-Irish relations have been very difficult over the years. No one needs, we don't need to go into the history of that, but by the same token, there are many Irish people married to Brits and vice versa. There are many Britons that live in the Republic of Ireland. There are many Irish who live in mainland Britain. So I think that the optimistic side of me says that outweighs the negative, the differences over the status of Northern Ireland. But I still insist that for those of us who grew up in Northern Ireland, well, I came to England when I was 14, but those of us who feel British, that needs to be respected. It needs to be understood and it needs to be respected because that 100 years, 1922 when Northern Ireland stayed in the United Kingdom and the rest of Ireland after the Irish Civil War went independent. Those 100 years can't be dismissed because Ulster men and women sacrificed for the United Kingdom. Belfast was one of the worst split cities, so Belfast went through just as much as what Coventry went through. And it may sound like a mute point, but I make it because it's a shared sacrifice, and it's an indication of the sort of sentiments that people have in Northern Ireland. Um, so I think that you also get people on the left in England who believe in a united Ireland. Again, they have this prejudice about Ulster Unionists. They think, oh, we're all right wing bigots. I'm centre left in a lot of political areas, and like I say, I've never associated myself with that sort of militant sectarianism, the likes of Ian Paisley espoused. Never. But I still would say that this, when I see comments like Ireland for the Irish, it's a gross oversimplification of history. You cannot just treat people who have had generations and generations and generations as being English invaders, generations of settlement in Northern Ireland as being English invaders. Yes, we know there's a dark history there. Yes, there's the Cromwellian conquest. I get all that. But my God, it was over 300 years ago, 370 years ago. So, you know, this animosity towards the sense of Britishness that those people have, it's irritating, to say the least. I mean, I get this in England all the time, and this is getting into the realm of what I was pointing out in the last video. All the time, it's like, oh, I have, I was in Ireland once, so I have friends in County Clare. That's great. Well done. So there's just a stubborn sort of refusal to recognise that there's a Northern Irish identity that needs to be respected and understood, and it is distinctive from the Irish identity. It is. So it doesn't mean that there can't be better relations. It doesn't mean that people can't be respectful and be friends and we can't move on from the dark days of the Troubles. But I think there are certain Irish nationalists who just want to kind of purge any sort of sense of British unionism. Recently, I even saw Sinn Féin people acknowledging that there is such a thing as Ulster unionism. And the irony is, Northern Sinn Féin spokespeople themselves acknowledge there is a unique Northern Irish identity. And they would actually be at loggerheads in that sense from Irish nationals from, say, Galway or Clare or Kerry, because they're still Northern Irish. They would say they're Irish and they would want a united Ireland, but they still recognise that Northern Irish identity. So this is something that absolutely has to be understood. I'll say this though, 30 years of bombings and maimings and killings, the IRA didn't achieve a damn thing, not one thing. All it done was made the British more resilient. That's all it done. All it done was increase anger towards the IRA. It made the Thatcher government much tougher. It didn't achieve a damn thing. And as much as I disagree with Scottish nationalists, and I hope beyond hope that the United Kingdom stays together in the coming years, at least the Scottish nationalists never resorted to terrorism. They can be vitriolic at times, and there's been a lot of angry exchanges in recent years. And I do think that there is a growing sectarianism within Scotland, which I'm wary of, but at least the Scottish nationalists have never resorted to terrorism. So that's important. You can argue, okay, there's a background to the Troubles, there was discrimination against Catholics, there were, you know, terrible things happening in the late 60s and early 70s that were definitely fuel for the fire. But no one will ever convince me that blowing up a nightclub or targeting the London Underground or targeting restaurants and cafes, both in Northern Ireland and on the British mainland, was ever morally justified in any sense of the word. And as for military targets, remember a lot of those, I mean, the attack at Deal Barracks in Kent, they weren't SAS soldiers, they weren't battle hardened veterans. These were young boys in a bandstand. So that needs to be understood. Anyone who thinks that the answer to Northern Ireland's issues are with violence, they're on the wrong side of history. So this small but determined group of thugs who want this to continue, who murdered Lyra McKee, who want, they're small, but they can't be underestimated. They're still dangerous. They can go to hell. I mean, what I find tragic is there are teenagers who were born after the Good Friday Agreement get involved in rioting, throwing things at the PSNI, missiles, getting involved in rioting, and all it is mindless hooliganism. You cannot tell me that they have some sort of ideological cause like Michael Collins did. All they are is criminals, idiots destroying their own communities. And that's what I find depressing about Northern Ireland, that there is still this mentality. And it comes down to leaders on both sides to take some damn responsibility and rein in on the extremes in their own midst and say, we denounce this, we support the PSNI in cracking down on this. So I'm going to be watching the situation depending on how things develop. As it stands, I don't think anything's going to happen absolutely immediately, but we'll see what develops. That's just my thoughts.